I think this is probably one of the most important conversations that I feel are integral when you talk about what will be the shape and future of a new world order. Because at the end of the day, it's the challenges that need to be answered, and climate challenges, I think one can safely say, is one that knows no boundaries. It most certainly doesn't go according to GDPs and developed and developing status. It impacts every country, and which is why we need answers together. And I'm hopeful that we'll find some of those today in this August panel. A quick introduction is in order. We'll get Eric Solheim as well. He's the former Minister of Climate and Environment of Norway. He's joining us from Oslo. Excellency Lindy Cameron is here. She's British High Commissioner to India. Harjeet Singh, Global Engagement Director, Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And we have Mr. Shishir Priyadarshi, who's the President of the Chintan Research Foundation. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking out the time. And Eric is also with us here. Let me start by asking one thing, which I think would also set the context of why this conversation is so important, which is the fact that the speed with which we are seeing climate catastrophes happening around the world, their recurrence is now happening at an alarming pace. Developed countries are facing extreme challenges, but that also gives an idea about the fact that if the largest countries are struggling, then the extent of impact for developing and poor countries is, I think, frankly, unimaginable, because they don't have the framework, the solutions, and response as well. So that's one question I feel that all of you should answer in terms of when you talk about climate catastrophes, their impact, their speed, how does that play into the urgency with which governments need to find a solution? Ma'am, let's start with you.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. I think the lived experience of climate emergencies helps people to understand why their governments need to take policy action now. And nowhere is that more evident, actually, than here in India, seeing the floods, the landslides in Kerala and in Odisha. So I think it is really helpful in driving that sense of urgency. And we know that matters not just in helping to build a global consensus for policy change, but also in helping people to invest in what they need for resilience. So we've been really proud, for example, to be a founder member, along with India, of CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which is helping to ensure that best practice from India is actually delivered in the Global South to ensure that infrastructure is built in a resilient way. And we know that is really good value for money. We know that every dollar invested in resilient infrastructure pays off 4 times over. So it is important and it is really urgent. We're also really proud of what the UK government is doing. I mean, my new government takes climate change incredibly seriously. It was one of the first speeches that our new Foreign Secretary gave, highlighting the importance and the urgency of the climate and nature crisis. And we were really proud, for example, that we've literally just closed the last UK coal-fired power station on our journey to carbon-free electricity by 2030.
Okay, all right, so you want to respond, and then I get it, Mr. Priyadarshi as well?
Yeah, I totally agree with the High Commissioner that this series of disasters that we have seen, which are not only affecting developing countries, but also developed countries, are serving as a wake-up call, and many countries are stepping up. But I also see a risk, and I must highlight here, that as rich countries are going to get more and more affected by climate change, which they did not imagine just a couple of years ago. They were thinking that only developing countries...
This is something that only happens to other parts of the
exactly.
world. It ain't happening here.
And most vulnerable countries who are going to be struggling with impacts, who also have very less capacity to deal with it, they did not really invested enough domestically in preparing for resilience. We have seen in Germany, we have seen in the UK, in the US. So now the challenge is going to be, and that's the risk, that they're going to start looking a lot more inwards, which means they are going to be far more cautious about the resources that they invest in the international cooperation. They're going to start using it internally. And that challenge remains. So on one hand, it serves as a wake-up call, but on the other hand, it may impact the flow of finance to developing countries.
I hate to give a comparison to that. It's reminding me of the COVID vaccines, unfortunately, that you start looking more inwards than ensuring that some of the other most affected parts also are brought into the ambit of protection. Mr. Priyadarshi, yeah.
Thank you, and a very good morning to everyone. Look, while it's true that the kind of disasters we are seeing are spread all over the world, but I think we shouldn't shy away from saying that it's impacting far more those who were historically much less responsible for the state of affairs that we are in today. We try and talk that it's fairly uniform across the globe. It's definitely not. Sure, in terms of natural disasters, it may be, but if you look at the kind of migrations that are happening within countries because of the extreme heat that is being generated, it's much more in the most vulnerable and developing countries. That's one. But the second point, again, it's like a point of caution, that while the narrative must be on sustainability, for a lot of developing countries, and I think India included very strongly in that narrative should actually become a three-pronged narrative. We fight on sustainability, but we don't at all lose our emphasis on economic growth and energy security. For a country like India, we've got to ensure that every single nook and corner of this country has reliable and affordable. I think the key word is affordable energy. We must also not forget the fact that India is aiming to be a developed country at 2047. All three must go hand in hand.
Indeed. And that's a question I'm going to come to in a bit after giving Eric a chance to come up with opening comments, which is about the trust deficit and also the fact that you can't have the same finishing line if you don't have the same starting point. And I think that's the fundamental point in terms of the trust deficit that exists on issue related to climate. But Eric, come in there on the fact that will these unfortunate incidents that are happening very regularly become a catalyst towards a more concerted action towards these climate challenges?
I agree to what everyone else in the panel said about the seriousness of the climate crisis, and I also for sure agree that we should not blame India or the developing world. Look, US emissions up to today per capita are 25 times Indian. So no one should blame India. But the game changer is not this. The game changer is something fundamentally different. And that is, for the first time in human history, it's possible to see environment action and climate action as an opportunity, not just a problem. Climate change is a huge problem, but it's also an enormous opportunity. And let me give you one example. The Indian state of Gujarat has now set the target to 100 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2030. And in the combination of the good leadership from Prime Minister Modi at the center, the leadership from the state of Gujarat, and engagement of Adani and Reliance and all big industrialists, I'm pretty confident that we'll reach this goal. And look, it's enormous. That is, for instance, 20 times the entire energy grid of Nigeria, which is the biggest nation in Africa. If Gujarat reaches this aim, it will put Gujarat, only the state of Gujarat, not India, but the state of Gujarat will then be the 8th biggest nation in the world when it comes to renewables. So this is big, big, big. And it's an opportunity for prosperity, for jobs, for income, for driving the state towards development. So Gujarat is not seeing climate change just as a problem, but as an enormous opportunity. And the same spirit is there with Prime Minister Modi, and is there in many other states of India, like Tamil Nadu, or with the new leadership of Andhra Pradesh, and I can mention a lot more. And the old days where the discussion was, do we want to take care of Mother Earth, or do we want to develop? That's gone. Now we can develop and take care of Mother Earth by seeing it all as an opportunity.
All right. You want to respond? You want to come in there in terms of what he's saying? Okay. Then let me come to the other bit, which I think is fundamental to being able to solve the climate puzzle, so to say, which is around the trust deficit, where I say that developing countries say historical polluters now want everybody to have the same finishing line when we didn't start at the same time. We can't be paying for sins of developed countries. That's essentially the crux of the argument, and that's where it boils down to. Ma'am, I want you to respond to how do you bridge that trust deficit before making any meaningful progress?
So I think you've got a real point. Our Foreign Secretary said in his speech that he had heard that developing countries didn't believe the system worked for them. And it's really important we recognise that. But it's also important to recognise we all live on the same planet. So ultimately, we do all live in the same world. And it's therefore important that both countries like the UK commit to the ambitious goals we've committed to, for example, net zero by 2050, decarbonise electricity by 2030. It's incredibly important we do that to address our responsibilities. It's also important that we ensure the scale of climate finance is available to help India and other countries grow at the pace they want to, create that low-cost, low-carbon electricity that allows for the incredible ambition India has in a way that doesn't increase the risks for the planet. And I think that potential is there. There's a lot we can do as governments. We're committed to MDB reform, for example, to making sure there is more affordable finance. We're also committed to making sure that the City of London, as a centre for global finance, helps to unlock the potential of the private sector for this. And indeed, we're working here in India on technology and research to ensure that we're supporting those incredibly ambitious goals. I really do think, after 6 months in India, that India is the place where this is going to happen. It is the country that matters most for the future of the planet and for climate change, because India's ambition for development should not in any way be constrained by the responsibilities of the planet.
Let me also ask you about the fact that a lot of your experience at the WTO, where some of these negotiations took place a couple of decades back, it was the same conversation. The context may be different, which was more trade and less climate, but the conversation was the same, which is around, you don't know the starting point, but the finishing line has to be the same for all nations put together. Talk to us about that experience in terms of being able to bridge some of this trust deficit, because at the end of the day, it's about negotiations and breaking that deadlock.
Thank you, Gauri. Look, this is not the first time a global issue is being discussed multilaterally. And I think the way the trade agenda was set in the 1990s has perhaps a lot of lessons for us in the way we set the climate agenda. One of the biggest reasons that the trade agenda, and by the setting up of the WTO in 1995, led to a huge trade deficit was for two reasons. One is because developing countries en masse were promised huge amount of gains if they simply opened up their markets. This was the byline. Lower your tariffs and heavens are going to open up. But the second was, very often, and this happened for the first 10 years in WTO, others kept telling you what you need to do. We know what's best for you. You follow this path. And I think that resulted in a huge deficit of trust. And I think that is something we must avoid when we are setting the climate agenda. Let me just quote two things. One, let me quote what David Cameron said yesterday. He said very clearly, 2 wrongs don't make a right. I totally agree. But that is subject to a wrong being done by me and a wrong being done by you. What about 2 wrongs being done by the same side? And that is something I think we absolutely need to avoid when we are setting the climate agenda. And trust me, the developing countries are doing far more. I quote India. India is committed to $2.5 trillion of investment between 2015 and 2030. That's huge. It probably was absolutely unthinkable many years ago. But yes, we do need to be met halfway. And the reason, Gauri, is, and I probably would give this example in WTO and, with the permission, give it here. We are prepared to drive down the highway towards zero emission. Absolutely with you. But we are going to do it at our speed. You do not tell us the speed at which we drive down that highway, and you don't tell us these are your restricted number of pit stops that you can do. We will get there, exactly. The starting point is there, and the goal we will reach. But yes, give us the flexibility because of very, very different conditions and support. But I'm certain if you look at the path in the last 15 years, it's towards much more trust. So I hope that that deficit will soon be a thing of the forgotten past. Thank you.
Great. Eric, let me also then ask you on this fact. We mentioned about developed countries, the fact that they're still looking at ways of revisiting some of the older mechanisms in terms of fossil fuel for powering the energy needs at a time when there is global conversation around pressurizing or asking developing nations to do their bit. Come in on that. We've mentioned some of those factors here.
I mean, absolutely. But the change on climate will not come from the multilateral system. And as you said in the conversation with Kishore Mahbubani earlier today, the United Nations is so weak and basically nothing of substance is happening in the climate talks. What will change is the action which particularly developing nations are taking for their own interest. Look, China is now 60% of all green developments on planet Earth. Solar, wind, hydropower, electric cars, electric batteries, high-speed rail, metro, whatever you can mention, tree planting, China is 60% of the global development, one nation alone. Move on to Indonesia. Indonesia has brought deforestation down to zero in the second biggest rainforest nation in the world. Fantastic development. And then, which is the topic of today, I was in Ahmedabad very recently with Prime Minister Modi and listened to his speech. He spoke for 1 hour. He only spoke about the opportunities for India in the green transformation, how India can capture jobs and prosperity by going green. Look, if India replaces oil and gas with solar and wind, the sun is Indian, the wind is Indian, well, it saves money. It saves money which can be used for education and health. And today, solar and wind energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. In the past, of course, if you wanted to go renewable, it was a cost because coal was much cheaper. But that was the past. Now, solar and wind is the cheapest energy. You save money if you turn to the renewables. And that's why India and China and Indonesia and Brazil and so many other developing nations are now in the lead. 10 years ago, if anyone asked me, where should you go to see climate action? I would say, please go to Brussels, please go to Berlin, and to Paris. If you ask the same question today, I would say, please go to Beijing, please go to Delhi, and please go to Jakarta. And by the way, this is also why this agreement now between India and China is so important, because these are the two drivers of climate action and environment actions in the world. They can work more closely together, trade and create jobs by mutual investment.
Absolutely.
That will be a major driver of the green transformation.
Absolutely. So when you talk about climate action plan, we are here in New Delhi, and that could be the starter. Then the question that comes is Global South essentially going to provide those solutions? Eric mentioned solar. And that is not just the cheapest, safest, and most easily replicable model of being able to provide basic energy needs. The larger question is Global South essentially going to lead the way for finding climate solutions? Is that now going to be the fact that has to drive global negotiations? There's COP around the corner that's going to happen next month in Baku. Is it time to let Global South do that bit now?
So I have to say, I think India is going to lead the world in this. I think India has the scale, the innovation, the technology, but also the need. That aspiration to get to developed India by 2047 requires that real level of ambition to match that pace and scale. But also India has the ability then to create a generation of low-cost technology, which actually very few other countries have got the ability to do, and then to export that technology for the benefit of countries in the global south. So I am looking forward to decades of Indian leadership in this space, which I think is incredibly exciting and something we're really proud to be working on. We're proud to be a founder member again of the International Solar Alliance, which I think is a fantastic opportunity to drive the ability to take solar to scale at low cost in a way that has massive opportunity for other countries. And I think part of it is just it's a different challenge. Decarbonizing your economy is one thing, but actually working out how you get low cost low carbon growth is a different and in many ways more exciting opportunity. So I think there's an opportunity there not just for governments, but also for the private sector. This is an area where I expect to see not only private flows, but also, frankly, private profits as a result of them. And that's a really good thing.
In fact, and that brings me to the part which is around technology. But I don't consider myself to be someone who understands cutting-edge technology. But from a layman point of view, and I speak for most people here in the audience, barring my boss, of course, which is that technology could find solutions that could really break this puzzle about climate funding. Because, if you look at the numbers in terms of funding, last year's climate finance, the number was about $100 billion, about $110 billion. Hurricane Helen alone, the damage is $160 billion. So you cannot solve this by just garnering more funding. It's not going to come. Technology needs to find those solutions for us. How do you go about addressing that, and how do you break that aspect?
Most of the technology is already there when we talk about solar and wind, and that's what Eric was also underlining. So we don't have to invest a lot in now finding new technologies. Yes, in certain cases, like steel industry and cement and aluminum,
exactly, yeah.
hydrogen,
that's where you need it. Yeah.
That's where it's at a nascent stage, and battery storage, there are areas where we have to invest. But I think we can massively scale up the current technology. So I would argue that we need more finance right now for the existing technology, and also ensure that that production is happening locally, and that's where the role of WTO and trade comes in. That should not become a barrier. Why only India and China who should lead? I would say production should happen in Kenya's and Malawis and Nepal's of the world as well.
Come in on that in terms of both the technology aspect and the fact that some of what we already have can be replicated with India leading the way.
Look, I think India is already showing the way. And again, it's not because the three of us sitting on the panel are saying, so you look at the figures. Look what India has done in the last 10 years. And you also asked about what the Global South is doing. India added about 200 gigawatts of additional capacity in the last 10 years, out of which more than 150, that's 75% of the additional capacity came from renewables. So we added about 175 gigawatts of additional renewable capacity. And this we did because, yes, continuously technology, more adaptive, more reasonable, more replicable is coming in. But still somewhere, Gauri, and perhaps, depending on time available, I have to quote that, we also need to change the global narrative about what the Global South is doing. Irrespective what India has done. And I'll with your permission, and that's why I'm delighted that NDTV is now also doing a global channel, because we need to get the story out. I'll just quote two headlines, one most recent. This was published by The Telegraph, 2024, which is this year. It says, international leaders express dissatisfaction with India's voting patterns concerning climate initiatives. Now, for me, that's terrible. Look what we are doing, and yet what is being highlighted is our voting patterns. And if you look at the NGO report of just a year back, it says an NGO published finding criticized the gap between India's environmental promises and its action in transitioning to green resources. Come on, you've got to give me a break. The Adani Group itself by 2030 would have contributed 50 gigawatts to green energy. I mean, India's taken actually quantum steps. But yes, we really need to highlight that. We need ambassadors like Eric there. We need the high commissioners there. We need activists here. But we need, most importantly, global news channels like NDTV pushing the story. Thanks.